Professor Cottingham is a Professorial Research Fellow at Heathrow College at the University of London. He's Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the University of Reading, where I did my undergraduate, and to which I'm eternally grateful, as well as an Honorary Fellow of St John's College here at Oxford. He's a leading Descartes scholar with interests in early modern philosophy, the philosophy of religion, and moral philosophy. His latest book is called Philosophy of Religion Towards a More Humane Approach, and that will be published by Cambridge University Press later this year. And as I've said, Professor Cottingham is also author of the article, What is Humane Philosophy and Why is it at Risk?, which was in many ways the impetus to our project. So please give a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Ralph and Mikołaj and all the other organisers, both at Warsaw University and here in Oxford at the Ramsey Centre, and of course our hosts at Blackfriars, and to thank everyone for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. So there's a short handout which is just a kind of rough schema with a few quotations on it. So the current state of philosophy. Well, many people, I think, certainly many young people, come to philosophy with high expectations. They possibly think it will help towards the exalted goals of the kind mentioned in the rubric for the famous Templeton Prize, namely expanding our vision of human purpose and ultimate reality. Or they may think philosophy deals with questions about the meaning of life, actually a growing topic in the recent literature. Or they may have heard that it includes the study of metaphysics, which Adrian Moore defines in a very interesting recent book, The Evolution of Metaphysics, as the most general attempt to make sense of things. But when they get to university, I think I've certainly heard many say this to me, many students are disappointed. They find that most academic courses steer clear of these grand questions or anything like them, and they find their researchers are engaged, their teachers, who are doing something called research, are engaged largely in debating minutiae with other academics. It's almost as if philosophers have deliberately withdrawn from the great questions about how one should live and how we should understand our relation to the rest of the cosmos, and instead decided to model themselves on scientists. The very word research, which we have to use nowadays in funding applications, is very significant. Only accessible to those with long years of special training. Now, I think myself, I know with several people here today and who are going to be speaking today, that this quasi-scientific model of philosophy is a mistake. Part of the reason it comes about is, of course, institutional. To get a job in the academy, you have to win your spurs, and the safest way to do that is to retreat into a specialist area where your arguments end up being so intricate and convoluted that no one is going to find it easier, or certainly the examiners may not find it too easy to attack them. Indeed, to be honest, very few people are going to find it very easy or worthwhile to read them in the first place unless they're paid to do so. But quite apart from questions about style and readability, I think there's a more serious, even more serious cost, that of fragmentation. There's a serious danger, I think, of the subject breaking up into a host of sub-disciplines whose practitioners live in their own private worlds. The label analytic, which is conventionally used of the kind of philosophy done in the Anglophone world, is significant here. I mean, analytic is often contrasted with continental, and that distinction, I think, is one that a lot of people feel is no longer very helpful. But, of course, etymologically, analytic means breaking down into smaller elements. And that's clearly a strategy that's worked extremely well in many of the sciences. But I think it's by no means self-evident that it's the right way to achieve philosophical understanding. It can, of course, be awesomely painstaking and precise, but, as Bernard Williams once observed, it can often boil down to a specious mimicry of scientific procedures where, quote, this is Bernard Williams, the practitioners persuade themselves that if they fuss around enough with qualifications and counterexamples, they're conducting the philosophical equivalent of a biochemical protocol. Now, I don't want to be too critical here. Much specialist work in today's philosophy is most impressive as far as intellectual quality is concerned, and there's nothing whatever wrong with intricate argument as such. Careful, logical argument is and always has been, I think always should be, one of the jewels in the philosophical crown. But if it's used only within isolated areas of research, then something has gone wrong. I think we need to remember that the greatest philosophy, the kind that doesn't just boost an academic career, but shapes the thinking of a generation, is, or even inspires new ways of looking at the world, is generally not of this specialist kind. And if we look at Plato, Descartes, Aquinas, Spinoza, Hume, Kant, what is striking is, I think, the wide reach of their thought, the extent to which it spans a great many of what we now think of as separate or distinct areas of philosophy. Plato, for example, has a worldview that has implications for ethics, politics, for science, mathematics, metaphysics, aesthetics, and the same, the kind of stamp of his philosophical vision can be seen in his writings in all these areas. And Descartes, too, Ralph mentioned in the introduction, has what I've called a synoptic vision of philosophy. One, in fact, he uses an organic image to describe his philosophical system: metaphysics, the roots; physics, the trunk; and various specific branches, including ethics. I think all the great canonical figures I've just mentioned had a grand synoptic vision of the nature of the world and the place of humankind in it, the extent and limits of human knowledge, and the best way for humans to achieve the right way to live. Now, of course, not everyone, we can't all be Plato or Descartes, but we can all, I think, be participants in what Bernard Williams, in the paper Ralph referred to, called the wide humanistic enterprise of making sense of ourselves and our activities. So the kind of humane philosophy that I want to advocate would be part of this enterprise. So let me come on to the section 2, if you've got the handout, talking particularly about the place of reason. Now, Thomas Hobbes, in the mid-17th century, once dryly observed that arguments seldom work on men of wit and learning when they have once engaged themselves in a contrary opinion. Now, one could read this, perhaps as Hobbes himself intended it, as deploring the fact that even people of high intelligence, what Hobbes calls wit, are not protected from remaining stuck in their preconceived opinions. One remembers the warning issued by Hobbes's contemporary Descartes about the tendency of preconceived opinions, prejudicia, to cloud the natural light of reason. But one could perhaps subversively maybe read Hobbes's remark in a different and rather more interesting way, as saying that abstract reasoning alone is not enough in philosophy. Abstract argument alone is not enough. We need some element of commitment or engagement, as Hobbes put it in that quotation. Arguments seldom work if people have engaged themselves in a contrary opinion. The commitment might be an essential prerequisite for reason being able to do its work in the first place. Now, rational argument is obviously, as I've already conceded, in fact stressed, something philosophy should maintain. Consistency, coherence in argument. And the quotation from Socrates, so often brought up, following the argument where it leads. Now, analytic philosophy is clearly committed to all that, and let me make it absolutely clear that I subscribe wholeheartedly to those values. They're the values of the tradition in which I was trained. But in the way a considerable number of contemporary analytic philosophers approach this task of rational inquiry, I think there is something more questionable, a kind of additional dimension which is more questionable. And this is the assumption that the truth is, as it were, flat, and that we reach the best results in philosophy by eliminating all ambiguity from our discourse and striving to emulate the austere, pared-down language of modern science. And I think increasing numbers of philosophers subscribe to this view. Brian Leiter, for example, has spoken of, this is on the handout under 2, as I see also that the quote from Hobbes is there too. Leiter speaks of the naturalistic revolution in philosophy that holds that philosophy should adopt and emulate the methods of successful sciences. He speaks of that with enormous enthusiasm as a kind of great breakthrough in the subject. Eleanor Stump, a leading American philosopher of religion, has recently in her book Wandering in Darkness, a remarkable book if you haven't read it, voiced disquiet about this trend in analytic philosophy, particularly in areas like moral philosophy, philosophy of religion, which have to do with the significance of the human predicament and the deep moral and spiritual challenges of our lives. She again supports the precision and the clarity that are the hallmarks of the analytic tradition, but deplores what she calls its cognitive hemianopia. Now, as you know, myopia is short-sightedness. Hemianopia is kind of blindness to what one side of the brain is, one half, from the Greek for half, of the brain is telling you. Now, the reference, of course, is to recent work in neurophysiology and human psychology, which suggests that the left hemisphere of the brain plays a major role in the exercise of logical and conceptual and analytic abilities, while the right hemisphere is more concerned with intuitive, imaginative, and holistic forms of awareness. Why should we suppose, says Stump, that left brain skills alone will reveal all that's philosophically interesting about the world? Ian McGilchrist, in a fascinating book, The Master and His Emissary, a remarkable tour de force which covers both scientific and literary resources, says the following. This is on the sheet, the long quotation in the middle of section 2. There are two ways of being in the world, McGilchrist says. One is to allow things to be present to us in all their embodied particularity, all their changeability and impermanence, interconnectedness, a part of the whole forever in flux. In this world we feel connected to what we experience, part of that whole, not confined in subjective isolation. The other is to step outside the flow of experience and experience our experience in a special way, to represent the world in a form that's less truthful, apparently clearer, therefore cast in a form that's useful for manipulation of the world and one another. This world is explicitly abstract, these are the key notions, compartmentalized, fragmented, static. From this world we feel detached. In relation to it, we feel powerful. As you can see, there's a kind of psychoanalytic diagnosis there about this obsessive concentration on detached analytic forms of understanding. Interesting topic in itself, which I won't go into this afternoon. But the implicit connection is there's a kind of form of autistic retreat, I think, involved in this exclusive concentration on analytic left brain forms of awareness. Just let me add, this distinction between the two halves of the brain and their functions is obviously a crude oversimplification, as McGilchrist himself stresses. He's not saying the left brain does this, the right brain does that. On the contrary, he stresses that in most human activities there are constant interplay between the two. In fact, this is another issue, but I don't myself think it's essential to draw on the specific results of modern neurophysiology to make this distinction between these two modes of awareness. Interestingly, Nietzsche, in Human All Too Human, referred to the two ventricles of the brain, just totally speculative, of course, because he didn't know anything about neurophysiology, and he talked about impoverishment produced by a culture dominated by scientific explanations, and thought we might need two ventricles of the brain, one for science, the other for non-science, lying beside each other. So, as often with Nietzsche, some very interesting anticipations of some more recent ideas. So anyway, the basic thought of Stump and others is that we need additional resources than logical analysis. So what might be these resources? For Stump, they're going to include narrative, scriptural resources, chiming in with a call from several philosophers over the last decade or two for a kind of literary turn in philosophy. Martha Nussbaum is perhaps best associated with this, who argues, in the case of literary texts, but I think there's a lesson here for philosophy, that to appreciate them we need to be attentive, careful, but porous. That notion of porosity, allowing ourselves to some extent to be receptive to a text, rather than constantly stopping and saying, "Oh, what does that mean? Define that term. Wait a minute, stop. If you constantly do that while reading a poem, you're in a way closing yourself off from the meaning of the poem. Of course, there may be a place for that mode of analysis after reading it through, but it can't take the place of the more holistic, porous receptivity. Roger Scruton, who'll be talking later today, has actually said that he thinks that literature and philosophy are complementary components of a single enterprise. I think there are perhaps some problems about that, but I'll just mention it. I think the idea of some degree of continuity is probably right. So what Stump proposes is a kind of antiphonal structure, like two halves of a choir, if you like. We're back to this two halves imagery. So, first of all, the narrative is considered not just as an example, that would be patronizing. And the philosophers often say, let me take a literary example. And then they get back to their argument, as if you could really gloss over that. The idea of the primacy of the text, of the example, the story, I think needs to be seriously considered. So the antiphonal structure is first you listen to the text and then perhaps you go back and do some breaking it down, but you allow both halves to speak to each other. What does this mean about the right style for philosophy? I guess not that you have to constantly bombard the reader or the listener with quotations from literature or scripture or poetry, but it might allow scope for a much more generous deployment of those resources than is common in our subject as it is today. One of the key points I want to make about these literary resources is that they're characteristically multi-layered. They don't operate on this flat plane of literal meaning alone, but have many resonances. They resonate with us on many levels. And so any plausible account of the human condition, any plausible philosophical account of the human condition must make space, I think, for the crucial role of imaginative, symbolic, poetic forms of understanding. To deepen and enrich our conception of the world we inhabit and ourselves. So from that, I think it follows that it can be a serious error to try and reduce all philosophical thinking to a bald set of factual or quasi-factual assertions whose literal propositional content is to be clinically isolated and assessed. There obviously is a worry that departing from analytic detachment might involve a loss of philosophical integrity. I once quoted, I think it was either a poem or a passage from scripture, one or the other, at a conference in America, and someone at the back snarled and walked out, muttering, "We're not doing philosophy anymore. This is," as if I was trying to pull the wool over his eyes. So, of course, we need to use philosophical caution when imaginative or emotional resources are being invoked. But equally, if we insist on detachment all the time, I think that may be less a sign of integrity, philosophical integrity, than what Nussbaum has called a stratagem of flight, trying to escape from this receptivity that acknowledges all the aspects of our humanity. We might, if you want to put it in Aristotelian terms, take on board Aristotle's warning that our methods have to be suited to the subject matter we're dealing with. Or we might want to reflect on, perhaps more resonantly, on Andrew Louth's comment that philosophy is to do with a kind of understanding which involves a growth, this is on the handout at the bottom of section 2, a growth of experience, not primarily an increase in knowledge, but rather an escape from what had deceived us and held us captive. Learning by suffering, he's thinking particularly here of religious types of learning. Suffering in the process of undeception, which is usually painful. So just a brief word now on section 3, ways of philosophizing about religious belief. The general points I've been making, I think, have particular force for philosophy of religion. As it's standardly taught in modern university courses, a large part of philosophy of religion focuses on so-called natural philosophy, natural theology, the examination of pure, rational demonstrations of God's existence, which are intended to appeal, either demonstrative or probabilistic arguments, which are intended to appeal to any rational inquirer, irrespective of their commitments or lack thereof. The aim is impartial investigation to be tackled by intellectual inquiry alone. I think from what I've said, it should already be clear that there's a cost if philosophy of religion were to be restricted entirely to that mode. It's not that there's anything wrong with such work. It can be philosophically valuable in all sorts of ways. But philosophy is surely about more than skill in evaluating arguments or accumulating knowledge about the various moves and counter-moves in an abstract intellectual debate. At its best, I think, at its deepest and most rewarding, it's always about not knowledge but understanding, as Tony Kenny has put it in that quotation under 3. It's not a matter of expanding knowledge or acquiring new truths about the world. Philosophers not in possession of information denied to others, but philosophy is a matter of understanding, that's to say, organising what's known. And that's actually, Kenny there is proposing a rather modest Wittgensteinian conception, which I wouldn't entirely go along with, because I don't want to restrict philosophy to that. But I think his basic conception is right in the distinction between knowledge and understanding. The more one thinks about it, I think it's clear that understanding can't operate just analytically, but needs to operate holistically, synthetically, achieving, as I put it, a synoptic view about how the various elements of our worldview fit, or our world fit together. Our world, how do you understand the phrase our world? It could, of course, be understood as Wittgenstein understood it in his early work, The Tractatus, as a collection of facts, rather like a kind of collection of atoms expressible as the set of all true propositions. The world is everything that is the case, that famous opening sentence of Wittgenstein's Tractatus. But of course, even in that early work, Wittgenstein allowed that there are things which couldn't be said on this austere model of knowledge as atomic facts picturing states of affairs, but which could be shown, as he put it. And of course, in his later view, in Philosophical Investigations, his view about language underwent enormous change, and the lesson to be drawn from his later philosophy is that if we want to understand any language, including religious language, we need to look at how it operates as part of the culture in which it's embedded. And the famous Wittgensteinian idea of Lebensform and forms of life was partly a holistic reaction against the very atomistic conception of meaning that he'd espoused in the Tractatus, where an individual proposition is a picture of reality. So Wittgenstein later came to see that our language games are interwoven with a whole lot of non-linguistic activities and can't be understood apart from the context that gives them life. Now, Wittgenstein's approach to religion has some problems of its own. Rightly or wrongly, he's come to be associated, I think actually wrongly, but that's a story for another paper, he's come to be associated with a so-called non-cognitivist view of religious language. That's to say that it's not truth stating at all in the traditional way. And I wouldn't want myself to go along with that. But I think for all that, there are very great insights to be learned from Wittgenstein's thoughts about language being embedded in a form of life. If we want to understand religious belief, we need to do more than analyze and dissect the truth claims involved. We need to understand the context, the praxis that gives life to those claims. And if you compare that with the typical modern courses on philosophy of religion, I think you're bound to notice that these modern courses take us into a very abstract domain that's very far removed from religion as it actually operates in the life of the believer. It's almost as if the philosophy of music were to confine itself to the abstract theories of musicologists without paying any attention to the transformative power of music in the lives of those who experience it, who play it, who listen to it. So I'm not dissing the project of natural theology, but it seems to me clear there is very much room for a more humane model for philosophy of religion, just to take that specific branch of philosophy, one that preserves the virtues of a critical methodology, but connects the subject more closely with the moral and spiritual sensibilities that have shaped people's lives over many centuries and inform the lives of believers today. Let me come on to 4 then, moving now quite swiftly towards the close. I want to allow plenty of time for discussion. Ancient religious imagery, going right back to the Gospels, speaks of the road to salvation as a journey that has to be entered on by passing through a gate, a wicket gate, as it appears in John Bunyan's famous 17th century allegory, Pilgrim's Progress. In Christian symbolism, of course, Christ himself is the gate or the door to salvation, Thura in John's Gospel 10. Like many, which people have to pass through to find pasture in those verses. Like many symbols, there are many layers of meaning to that. But the idea of a transition, something has to be gone through in order for certain possibilities to become open or actual, or for certain understanding to take shape, is, I think, a very suggestive one, and one that has application not just spiritually, but philosophically. The key point here is really to do with epistemology. If you think of an epistemology of detachment, that's often supposed to be the paradigm of proper philosophical inquiry. But it may be a way of hardening yourself against the kind of porousness that is a necessary condition for certain kinds of evidence to become salient. It's worth thinking here, I think, a bit, just as a case to consider, about spiritual praxis. I'm thinking of for example, the kind of monastic spiritual praxis that is not a million miles away from what's going on here. But I read this thinking particularly about the Benedictine tradition, which is very much a model for us, all the subsequent monastic traditions. The kind of activities associated with that, of course, are not exclusively intellectual. They may well have an intellectual component, but they're not directed towards the analysis of propositions or the evaluation of doctrines. Typically, spiritual exercises are polyvalent. They operate on many different levels: emotional, physical, aesthetic, moral, pre-rational, subliminal, introspective, collaborative, to use many categories in a very heterogeneous list. Consider the singing of psalms, one of the key elements in Benedictine spirituality and many subsequent traditions. It comprises recitation of words learned by heart over many weekly, monthly, yearly repetitions, formalized structure of praxis, pattern of observance, setting aside hours each day. There's a physical component, standing, sitting, in which the whole community participates, collectively and individually. And it involves music, not just as an optional extra, but essentially and integrally. There's a plain song chant, for example, carefully regulated with an antiphonal structure and various laid down forms. For example, the crucial 2 beats of silence at the colon, at the halfway point of each verse, of a psalm. Now, if you think about the experiences of someone attending divine office, and say, well, is it an emotional experience, intellectual, religious, moral, aesthetic, musical? I think that's a pointless question, because all the elements are involved, infused in a kind of total act of devotion. And you could think of the music here as a kind of icon, a part for the whole. It's an image of the whole, because the singing or chanting incorporates all the aspects of the person. Physical activity, lungs, vocal cords, mouth, shoulders, diaphragm, bodily posture, emotional expression and response, sensory appreciation, intellectual grasp, and in the finest examples, more complex kind of moral elevation and self-transcendence. Now, of course, there's a semantic content. The Psalms are sentences that have meaning, or consist of those, but very often they're not just about assertions or truth claims. They include, for example, cries of remorse, pleas for help, shouts of praise, songs of thanksgiving, expressions of hope, trust, and so on. And the point about these is that they should work holistically, gradually transforming and perfecting the lives of those who engage in this praxis, irradiating the quality of their lived experience. Now, what epistemological lesson do I want to draw from all that? I think the most important, the key point is that we can't just force evidence into a scientific template, because the most important kind of evidence in any philosophical inquiry may be of the kind that can only be accessed by passing through a gateway, if you like, to new transformed modes of understanding. And I think philosophy needs to take account of that if it's going to pronounce on the acceptability or otherwise of the theistic outlook. Just let me ask you to think about that term verification, evaluation of truth. Of course, in the positivist era of the middle of the last century, verification was taken to be the slogan, the key to meaning. The meaning of a proposition is the method of its verification. If you ask most philosophers working today, they'll say, oh, well, we've long since discarded all that stuff. Logical positivism has long since been dead. Well, technically that's true, but it seems to me the spirit of positivism in a certain way lives on in the naturalist paradigm that now dominates so much philosophy. It outlaws from a philosophical discourse, in many cases, what's not empirically grounded in some way or another through the methods of science. Perhaps this partly explains how the central questions in philosophy of religion are often presented in a way that makes the evaluation of truth claims absolutely paramount and prior, and the assessment of the evidence that's supposed to support these truth claims. But the evidence is always construed in a detached, impersonal way, as what Paul Moser has recently called spectator evidence, kind of evidence you can put on the table and assess whatever your background, commitments, or emotional or other outlook. But if you actually look at the process whereby individuals grow into a religious outlook, the slow development of the moral and spiritual understanding that defines the process, I think it suggests something rather different. There can't be any question of reaching a final verdict on the truth claims as a detached spectator outside the forms of practical and affective engagement through which alone genuine understanding can flourish. let me end with a final short section on the arts and the imagination. This is section 5 at the bottom. This conference is called Humane Philosophy in the Arts. So let me end by asking if the humane turn I'm advocating means assimilating philosophy to the arts. Well, over 20 years ago now, Richard Rorty announced something he called the end of philosophy. Analytic philosophy, he put it in the consequences of pragmatism, would become the same, or would and should become the same sort of discipline as we find in other humanities departments. I haven't got this quotation on the sheet, but it is the normal form of life in the humanities is the same as in the arts and belles lettres. A genius does something new and interesting, and his or her admirers begin to form a school or movement. Well, there's perhaps something right and something wrong about this. As far as the end of philosophy is concerned, its reports of philosophy's demise have been circulating in many milieux, in many centuries, and they've so far always turned out to be premature. And I think Rorty's own way of doing philosophy has problems, not least in his later book, Contingency, Irony, Solidarity, where his philosophizing, quote unquote, was so embedded in the contingencies of cultural and literary discourse that really some of the essays in that book were just essays in literary criticism. And one might unkindly add, not very good literary criticism at that. But on the other hand, as I've been saying today, the scientific model, to retreat from that back to the scientific model, won't do either. And so to that extent, Rorty is surely right. My own view, as I've been suggesting, is that philosophy is best placed to survive if it retains this holistic or synoptic perspective. It can't exactly assimilate itself to literature, but it can enrich itself with literary sensibilities while keeping to its ancient task of attempting to make the most general sense of things. Or to put it another, more traditional way, it can set about articulating and defending a Weltanschauung, an overall picture of reality and our place in it. Now, you can't just assert a Weltanschauung, a worldview, and then rhetorically embellish it. To be philosophy, it must be construed, the picture has to be argued for, it has to be well-grounded. But the critical point I've been suggesting is that we should resist the temptation to think that well-grounded must be construed always in a purely intellectualist way, which invokes only the kinds of methodological standards and evidence you find in science. The point's particularly applicable to the religious worldview, I think. Nicholas of Cusa in the 15th century alluded to the possibility of drawing on wider mental resources when he referred to the power of the imagination as a kind of pole, a baculum, which might enable you to vault over the abyss towards the divine. The word imagination is not very satisfactory, but stimulating these richer resources of the human mind might serve to make a worldview crystallize or coalesce, becoming not just a theoretical set of postulates, but a live option. I mean, the reason I think any labeling like right brain, faculty of the imagination, can be misleading. Think of the song Imagination, the old 1940s song, Imagination is funny, it makes a cloudy day seem funny. I don't know if you know that song. Imagination is hazy, is crazy, your whole perspective gets hazy. As if it sort of plunges us into a murk of kind of emotional sludge. Now, of course, construed that way could never be a guide to the truth. But there's another sense of the term which has a much longer history, going right back to Plato, for example, in the Symposium, where the imaginative faculty has the power to lift the mind up, to stimulate it in its upward ascent. This is Wordsworth's view when in the prelude he speaks of the imagination as but another name for absolute strength and clearest insight, amplitude of mind, and reason in her most exalted mood. So the humane philosophy I'm advocating moves us away, I suggest, from the science-based model towards a model that prioritizes understanding over verification. So we might reverse the slogan of the positivists, according to which meaning depends on verification. The more humane model would insist that in order to assess the truth or otherwise of a claim, you've got to first understand it. And understanding has to be construed not in a detached, always analytic way, but in an involved experiential way. We need to some extent to try and enter into it before we presume to dissect and evaluate it. Of course, entering into a form of life is personally risky in the way a scientific investigation is, or intellectual analysis is not. You have to be prepared to give up certain things, to abandon sources of gratification and respect that our entrenched habits incline us to cling to, especially if we pride ourselves on our superior supposed academic detachment and intellectual autonomy. Yet that image of the wicket gate I mentioned in Bunyan reminds us that there may be gates which are hard to enter, maybe even difficult to find, because of the sacrifice required, but which nonetheless open the way to transforming modes of experience. If philosophy is to aim at a comprehensive view of reality instead of a schematic breakdown of one isolated part of it, it should be prepared to open itself to all the available evidence, all the relevant evidence. And that, in the end, is what truly humane philosophy is about.